He was the ultimate anti-hero of the spaghetti westerns, the one individual that transformed silence into a weapon. Lee Van Cleef constructed his legacy on what one could call this chilling intensity that could unsettle even the legendary Clint Eastwood. However, the surprise was never within his gaze. It was within the secret list that held the actors that Lee Van Cleef hated. This feud is burned throughout the decades because of one reason: ego. And that one look that dared to cross the line. Let's dig deeper. Number 1. Clint Eastwood. Speaking of men that Van Cleef hated, Clint Eastwood is number 1, and it may shock you why. They first teamed up in 1965 on the hot dry plains of Almeria, Spain, in For a Few Dollars More. Van Cleef, a veteran B-movie heavy, went up against Eastwood, a young and stoic American actor with a gentle, mustached smile and an unnerving air of toughness, so calmly practiced, so cold-blooded. It unsettled men while it mesmerized them. He was, remembers Van Cleef, a little too good-looking for me, too handsome, too charming, too full of himself, and too convincing in his role, especially for a young up-and-comer with. But what was happening in the background? Van Cleef soon realized there was a pattern here. Yes, Eastwood was charming and mannerly, but once he landed back in Hollywood, he never looked back. In interviews that took place decades later, Van Cleef bitterly confessed, "Clint's gone Hollywood. He doesn't care who was there in front of him when he became a star." That was all that needed to be said. The man who made Eastwood an international superstar remained in the background. But by the time 1973 rolled around, Eastwood was beginning to direct his own movies. High Plains Drifter and The Outlaw Josie Wales presented ideal scenarios for a return to American westerns for Van Cleef, but the calls never arrived. It wasn't until he contacted Malpaso Productions, the company owned by Eastwood, that his letters were ignored. Later, the veterans of Rome remembered the few occasions when the two had crossed paths at European festivals. Eastwood had merely nodded politely, but said nothing beyond his empty smiles. It was a slow-burning betrayal. Van Cleef had to live through the best years of the young American, while his own star failed to translate back to Europe. He never criticized Eastwood publicly, but the animosity smoldered in private moments. Rumors circulated about the crew that Van Cleef would whisper about being used and cast aside, about summiting the heights only to be left behind. His friendship would never be the same after that. The protege became the traitor, and the resentment would be frozen in time. Number 2. John Wayne. The hatred between John Wayne and Lee Van Cleef had a depth that amazed veteran production teams. It began from the very moment that Van Cleef heard John Wayne refer to European Western films as some sort of cowboy movie. This was an attack not only on a genre that Van Cleef had dominated, but on every moment that he had worked to build his career. In 1965, in a Los Angeles studio lot, as Wayne walked past a poster announcing For a Few Dollars More, he reportedly shouted to his group, "These Italians will never substitute for the real thing in a Western." Van Cleef was in attendance and overheard his entire statement. His jaw clenched, and henceforth, he deliberately ignored Wayne altogether. The feud heightened throughout the late 1960s. Van Cleef was renowned throughout the rest of the world with Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, and his movies were gaining notoriety in the United States as well. Wayne represented the quintessential all-American cinema star, with John Ford as his catalyst. Van Cleef found Wayne's ego and obliviousness to Van Cleef's movies unacceptable. According to Paramount sources, Van Cleef deliberately shunned Wayne at all the social gatherings. The two never exchanged a word. At a promotional dinner gathering in 1967, Van Cleef was introduced to Wayne by a mutual friend. Van Cleef leaned back, looked right at Wayne with an unblinking stare, and cursed under his breath, "I don't waste my time with mascots." Wayne merely noticed and shrugged it off, thinking it was the stiff, haughty posture of a foreign actor. However, by the 1970s, the distance between them was irrevocable. They never acted together, and they never spoke to each other again, allegedly with Van Cleef refusing to sit at the same table with Wayne in official events, according to old-timers of European film festivals. Number 3. Charles Bronson. Van Cleef's anger at Charles Bronson was more impassioned than the rest combined. This feud started in Italy back in the early 1970s, both Van Cleef and Bronson being contenders for the lead roles in Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West. Van Cleef, being a regular collaborator with Leone in For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, naturally assumed that he would top the bill in this next masterpiece. But Bronson came. Tall, dark, and handsome, with charm that was impossible to ignore. He was cast instead. Van Cleef felt betrayed, humiliated, and deceived. On the sets, in Almeria, it was remembered that tension was marked. Van Cleef and Bronson were present together at some location. Their eyes barely met. Van Cleef was overheard muttering, "A block of granite shows more expression than that one." Bronson either didn't realize or didn't care. He went about the story with trademark icy calm. While Bronson's European stardom reached heights, Van Cleef just knew he was relegated to substandard European films he would otherwise never have taken. Producers have realized the anger in Van Cleef and adjusted their shooting schedules to make sure they didn't conflict. But once, when a small altercation occurred over props, Van Cleef walked off the set in a temper, leaving Bronson unruffled. In interviews, even many years after the fact, Van Cleef never wavered in his assessment of Bronson. He criticized the fact that the younger man came to be touted without undergoing the same theatrical and method acting training that Van Cleef himself experienced. At the same time, he begrudgingly admitted that the public adored Bronson. There was clearly much at stake for Van Cleef when he felt he'd been replaced by Bronson. By the late 1970s, the two men had nothing to do with each other. There was no reconciliation. The chill in their relationship continued in the background until the death of Van Cleef. Number 4. Yul Brynner. As soon as Lee Van Cleef met Yul Brynner, he disliked him passionately. Yul Brynner strode into every room he entered as though he owned it, exuding a surefire aura through his well-coiffed hair, impeccable posture, and attractive presence. To Van Cleef, it seemed like arrogance belied to a ridiculous extreme. The turning point occurred during a film festival in Rome in 1967. Brynner sneered on stage about European Western films as audience theater for people who lacked an understanding of true film. Van Cleef had the epithet hurled at him like a punch to the stomach. It did not take long before the two were offered a role in a European Western film. Brynner refused the role with the explanation that he would not share the screen with a second-rate gunslinger. This, Van Cleef felt, was a direct assault on his character. He would walk out of casting sessions, refuse endorsement functions, and warn his peers, "I don't waste my time on men who mistake ego for talent." This barb in particular had such sting because Van Cleef's own showmanship had been centered on dedication, hard work, and authenticity, not charisma and showmanship. Even at award ceremonies in the 1970s, the two individuals never had an opportunity to speak to each other. Van Cleef would be seated at the opposite end of the hall, staring at Brynner. Brynner was taking all the attention, everyone laughing at his remarks, when Van Cleef's disdain had to be contained. It was almost a tutorial on self-control versus ego. Number 5. Telly Savalas. Van Cleef didn't take any time growing out his distaste for Telly Savalas. When Savalas swaggered in on his Rome set in the 1970s, cigar clenched in both hands, ego installed in the room by default, the hatred was immediate. Van Cleef's very first experience shooting with the guy had Savalas ridiculed his signature stony stare in front of their work crew, blowing on his cigar as if he were the star with the world in attendance. Van Cleef was caught mid-step, glared at him for a moment, then turned his back and walked away without uttering a word. That was quickly followed by an escalation of tensions. Meetings about production turned into stare-downs. Workers described the electricity in the room whenever these two men found themselves under the same roof. Savalas pranced along in front of the set, tossing off one-liners and basking in the spotlight, while Van Cleef stayed statue still, his icy intensity speaking volumes without bothering to say a word. Off camera, Van Cleef was unambiguous in his attitude toward Savalas, confiding to co-workers, "I just can't stand that guy," stating unequivocally that he would not work on a set with him again. The contempt established the terms of every interaction. At European film festivals and award ceremonies, Van Cleef made sure to sit on the other side of the room. His icy gaze communicated itself readily. Savalas ignored it all and remained in the spotlight. By the late 1970s, all interactions had been cut off. To Van Cleef, Savalas represented everything he loathed: ego unaccompanied by talent, spectacle unpainted by discipline, attention diverted from craftsmanship. Number 6. James Coburn. The conflict with James Coburn was less public, but it was no less intense. Coburn was famous for his smooth charm and easygoing style, and he did not appear to be the type of man to offer resistance to Hill's rising stardom. However, the alleged problem was his casual approach to acting and his knack for stealing the show with his easygoing charm. For Van Cleef, who approached each role with grim seriousness, Coburn's easy style was no less than an affront. This tension never erupted into a raw confrontation. It simmered. It simmered over their vastly different philosophies: discipline versus ease, intensity versus cool. Well, that's it for our video today. But now, I'd love to hear from you. Which one of these epic rivalries shocked you the most? Wouldn't it blow your mind to find yourself standing in front of someone that you once loved and trusted, but now makes you feel betrayed? Let's get some conversation going in the comments below.